Hadirin sekalian, mengumumkan keberangkatan Duli Yang Maha Mulia Paduka Seri Sultan Perak Darul Rizwan diiringi oleh Yang Amat Berhormat Menteri Besar Perak Darul Rizwan. Ladies and gentlemen, announcing the arrival of His Royal Highness the Sultan of Perak Darul Rizwan, accompanied by the Honourable Chief Minister of Perak Darul Rizwan. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan selamat sejahtera. Menghadap Duli Yang Maha Mulia Paduka Seri Sultan Perak Darul Rizwan, Sultan Nazrin Muizzuddin Shah, Ibni Almarhum Sultan Azlan Muhibbuddin Shah Al-Makhrullah. Ampun tuanku, beribu-ribu ampun, sembah patik mohon diampun. Patik mohon limpah perkenan Duli Yang Maha Mulia tuanku untuk patik memulakan majlis. Ampun tuanku. Terlebih dahulu patik bagi pihak Universiti Sultan Azlan Shah dengan penuh hormat dan takzimnya merafak sembah menjunjung setinggi-tinggi kasih di atas limpah perkenan Duli Yang Maha Mulia tuanku sudi berangkat mencemaduli ke Third World Conference on Islamic Thought and Civilization di sini pagi ini. Sesungguhnya keberangkatan Duli Yang Maha Mulia tuanku bagi menyempurnakan majlis amatlah dinanti-nantikan. Ampun tuanku, patik mohon limpah perkenan Duli Yang Maha Mulia tuanku untuk patik turut mengalu-alukan para hadirin serta untuk meneruskan majlis dalam bahasa Inggeris. Ampun tuanku. Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Seri Diraja Dr. Zamri Abdul Kadir, Menteri Besar Perak Darul Rizwan, Yang Amat Berbahagia Orang Kaya Bendahara Seri Maharaja Datuk Seri Diraja Tan Sri Muhammad Zahidi bin Haji Zainuddin, Yang Berhormat Ahli-Ahli Majlis Mesyuarat Kerajaan Negeri Perak Darul Rizwan, Yang Amat Berbahagia Orang Besar-Besar Negeri Perak Darul Rizwan, Yang Amat Berbahagia Ahli-Ahli Dewan Negara Perak Darul Rizwan, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Profesor Dr. Nordin Kardi, Vice Chancellor Sultan Azlan Shah University and also Chairperson of WCIT 2016, Excellencies, distinguished guests and speakers, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri, Yang Berbahagia Datuk Sri, Yang Berbahagia Datuk, ladies and gentlemen. Alhamdulillah. All praise be to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, by whose grace and blessings we are able to be gathered here this morning for the opening ceremony of the Third World Conference on Islamic Thought and Civilization. We are indeed honored and privileged to be able to welcome His Royal Highness, the Sultan of Perak Darul Rizwan, to grace this event and to present the keynote address and thereafter to officially open this conference. We'd like to express our sincere gratitude also to all our distinguished speakers and guests for your kind presence here this morning. Ampun tuanku, we will begin the program with a recitation of the Surah Al-Hujurat, verses 11 to 13, by Al-Fadil Ustaz Wan Ainuddin Hilmi bin Abdullah. Dipersilakan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A'udzu billahi minasy syaithanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Innamal mu'minuna ikhwatun fa aslihu baina akhawaykum wattaqullaha la'allakum turhamun. Ya ayyuhalladzina amanu la yaskhar qaumun min قوم لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكن خيرا منهن ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب بئس الاسم الفسوق بعد الإيمان يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا يسخر قوم من قوم لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكن خيرا منهن ولا تلمزوا ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب بئس الاسم الفسوق بعد الإيمان ومن لم يتب فأولئك هم الظالمون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا أيحب أحدكم أن يأكل لحم أخيه ميتا فكرهتموه واتقوا الله إن الله تواب رحيم. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. صدق الله العظيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Terima kasih, thank you Al-Fadhil Ustaz Wan Ainuddin Hilmi. Ladies and gentlemen, may we now call upon Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Professor Dr. Nordin Kardi, Vice Chancellor of University Sultan Azlan Shah, to deliver the welcome address. Dipersilakan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih kepada pengacara majlis. Ampun tuanku, menghadap Paduka Seri Sultan Perak, Duli Yang Maha Mulia Sultan Dr. Nazrin Muizzuddin Shah, Ibni Almarhum Sultan Azlan Muhibbuddin Shah Al-Maghfurlah. Ampun tuanku, patik menjunjung kasih di atas perkenan tuanku mencemar duli berangkat ke majlis ini. Sesungguhnya dengan keberangkatan tuanku, maka bertambah serilah majlis ini dan amat besar ertinya kepada patik dan hadirin sekalian. Di kesempatan ini, patik mewakili yang amat berhormat Menteri Besar Perak dan hamba rakyat merafak sembah tahniah ke atas Duli Yang Maha Mulia tuanku sempena perlantikan sebagai timbalan yang di-Pertuan Agong. Ampun tuanku, beribu-ribu ampun, patik merafak sembah memohon perkenan ke bawah Duli Yang Maha Mulia tuanku untuk meneruskan ucapan patik bagi meraihkan tetamu-tetamu khas dan peserta-peserta konvensyen, terutamanya yang datang dari luar negara. Ampun tuanku. Yang amat berhormat Datuk Seri Diraja Dr. Zamri Abdul Kadir, Menteri Besar Perak Darul Ridwan. Yang amat berbahagia Orang Kaya Bendahara Seri Maharaja Datuk Seri Diraja Tan Sri Muhammad Zahidi bin Haji Zainuddin. Yang berhormat ahli-ahli Majlis Mesyuarat Kerajaan Negeri Perak Darul Ridwan. Yang amat berbahagia orang besar-besar Negeri Perak Darul Ridwan. Yang amat berbahagia ahli-ahli Dewan Negara Perak Darul Ridwan. Yang berbahagia Tan Sri, Datuk Seri, Datuk-Datuk, tuan-tuan dan puan-puan hadirin sekalian. Distinguished guests, respected panelists, paper presenters, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, please allow me to welcome you to the state of Perak Darul Ridwan. It is an honor for us at QUISAS to be able to host this conference for the third time and to have you here in this hall to discuss and deliberate issues pertaining to our present and the future well-being in this world. WCIT is the brainchild of the Menteri Besar himself, who is so determined to turn Perak into the world center of philosophical and intellectual discourse. The theme of Future World has been chosen for this year's WCIT 2016 to indicate the dreams and aspiration from and for every person globally to find peace and together in creating a better life, peaceful environment, and definitely a greater future ahead. Accordingly, the theme has been chosen in response to the United Nations post-2015 development agenda, with its newest sustainable goal, widening its target in finding solutions for all ongoing events and issues to achieve a greater community for a greater world in the year 2030. Your presence here is the testimony of our collective commitment and responsibility towards the achievement of the objective of this conference, which we believe will be constructive contribution to the world at present and in the future. Please have a good time and enjoy the conference with us. We look forward to listening and to recording your fruitful contribution. May our congregation of minds for the next 2 days will show us ways in nurturing a brighter future world, inshallah. Once again, welcome and thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih, thank you, Yang Bahagia Tan Sri. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, may we now call upon Yang Bahagia Tan Sri Professor Dr. Nordin Kardi to humbly invite and accompany His Royal Highness, the Sultan of Perak Darul Rizwan, to deliver the royal keynote address and thereafter to officially open this conference.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It gives me great pleasure to address this third conference on Islamic thought and civilization this year with the theme of Future World. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all our guests from overseas, as well as the many eminent and learned Malaysians who are here. As in previous years, we look forward to the presentation of papers and discussions on a wide range of interesting topics, which in the past have covered everything from the contribution of Islamic thought to philosophy to the expansion of Islamic finance. The United Nations Development Programme has identified 7 essential dimensions of human security, namely economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, and political security. I am glad to note that most of these areas will be directly or indirectly deliberated upon through the 5 sub-themes of this conference: future world of higher education, climate change and humanitarian issues, good governance, economics and finance, media and international politics, and young generation and leadership. Of the many topics to be discussed at this conference, I will focus my address this morning on the sub-theme of the young generation and leadership. Because ultimately, it is in the hands of the young that our future world lies. The young generation will play an absolutely central role in shaping our future world. They represent our collective hope for the future, and they are our greatest resource. It will be up to them to take the lead in responding to the formidable global challenges we currently face, whether from environmental degradation, from poverty, from war, terrorism, and geopolitical instability, and from the exciting but potentially dangerous impacts of the accelerating progress in technology in various fields. The ability of our youth to address these issues effectively will determine perhaps even the very survival of the world as we know it. The enormous strides that have been made in recent decades in reducing poverty means that today's youth are at least increasingly well equipped to deal with these challenges. The World Bank estimates that nearly 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty since the early 1980s, with rising incomes accompanied by gains in health and education. Although these gains have been concentrated in India and China, and particularly in China, they have been felt across the world, including in the Muslim countries. These improvements will contribute to the ability of today's young generation to address the global challenges that affect us all. Youth account for around a quarter of the global population, with an estimated 1.8 billion young people between the ages of 10 and 24. These are disproportionately concentrated in developing countries, where 9 out of 10 young people live. Across the developing world, and in the majority of OIC countries, youth account for closer to 1/3 of the population. Proportions are highest in the least developed countries, concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. In India alone, there are around 356 million young people, the highest number in the world. Of these, roughly 50 million are young Muslims. Other large youth populations can be found in Indonesia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. These have 67, 59, and 48 million young people, respectively. The youth are also currently the fastest growing demographic group in less developed countries, although this will change as incomes rise. But even when the proportion of youth starts to decline, their overall numbers will continue to increase. Mid-range projections by the United Nations suggest that there will be 2 billion young people by the middle of the century. This so-called youth bulge offers enormous potential. The higher proportion of productive to dependent members of society creates a major demographic dividend that can drive economic growth. This is in marked contrast to the challenge faced in more developed countries, where aging populations represent a growing burden on the declining proportion of those of working age. As well as their economic contributions, the largest ever generation of youth coming of age today can produce the leaders, the visionaries, and the change makers that the world so desperately requires. But the youth bulge also presents considerable challenges, particularly in relation to the increasing competition it will create for services and unemployment. Far greater investment in human capital in particular will be absolutely crucial if we are to ensure that today's youth are fully empowered, both to achieve individual fulfillment and to be able to contribute to society more broadly. As suggested in a UN report on this topic, Young people are the innovators, creators, builders, and leaders of the future. But they can transform the future only if they have the skills, health, decision-making, and real choices in life. The skills and choices that allow youth to play these roles may, however, be undermined by the increasing pressure on services associated with a large and growing youth population. Great strides have been made across the world in terms of health and education provision over the last generation or so. Some Muslim-majority countries have seen improvements of 25% or more in their education and health indicators since 1990, as reflected in the UNDP's Human Development Index. These measure life expectancy at birth, mean years of schooling, and expected years of schooling. Other measures show similar progress, with declining infant and maternal mortality and an expansion of tertiary education across the board. Countries with significant improvements in health and education outcomes can be found across the Muslim world, from Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan to Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and throughout the Middle East, and here in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and Indonesia. Many of these countries, as a result, are now classified as having high human development. The generation now coming of age have benefited directly from these advances over the decades. Improvements in health and education outcomes have been accompanied by rising incomes, with the two, of course, intimately linked, as strengthened human capital contributes directly to economic productivity. This also reflects the sustained economic growth that has been experienced across the world over the past few decades. So while more opportunities for advancement are now being generated, more people than ever before are able to seize them due to their greatly improved health and education status. This strengthened ability to access and exploit opportunity, and in this way achieve upward mobility, lies at the very heart of the development process as defined by Amartya Sen. For Sen, these social and economic freedoms, as well as the political freedoms necessary for their provision, represent both the means and the ends of development. Improved personal outcomes, in turn, provide a more solid foundation for individuals to play a bigger role in society as leaders, activists, and entrepreneurs. But unless greater investment is made directly into further expanding the provision of health, education, and other services, these gains may come under threat from the youth bulge. Shrinking employment opportunities for young people due to their increasing numbers carries even greater risks. Youth unemployment already presents a significant challenge globally, contributing to political unrest as well as migration flows. A relatively high proportion of international migrants are of this age group. Political turmoil and conflict are key factors behind the unprecedented levels of international migration we are currently experiencing. But many young migrants are driven simply by a lack of available employment in their home countries and the desire to build a better life in areas with greater employment opportunities. The two factors are also closely linked, with a lack of decent employment opportunities for the young itself contributing to political unrest. This process can become a vicious cycle as investors are discouraged from taking the higher business risks associated with political turmoil, thus further limiting employment creation. Relatively high levels of youth unemployment have been widely identified as a root cause in the youth-led uprisings of the Arab Spring. One estimate puts youth unemployment in Muslim countries at 15.6%, almost a quarter higher than the global average of 12.6%. In Tunisia, where the phenomenon started, youth unemployment is over 30%, while in Arab countries, 50% of those unemployed are between the ages of 15 and 24. In order to keep pace with projected population growth in the Middle East, an estimated 80 million new jobs must be created over the next 15 years. The failure to do so could contribute to further political unrest in the many countries that are experiencing a youth bulge in this way. Apart from demographic factors, employment is also under threat from new technologies, which are evolving at an ever-accelerating rate. Some futurists believe that current advances in robotics and artificial intelligence will create mass unemployment as machines take over from tasks previously done by humans. Machines can now be programmed to conduct tasks that involve mental as well as physical skills. These include driving, as well as various activities in the services sector, from fast food to retail. Machines can even be programmed to deliver professional services that require high levels of training, such as in medical and legal services. While the impact of these developments is hard to predict with certainty, this technological unemployment is likely to exacerbate greatly the problems created by the youth bulge. Despite these challenges from demographic and technological dynamics, today's youth are still better off than at any other time in history. The extent of this progress and its concrete benefits for the current generation of youth sometimes gets lost in the more negative focus of the international media on disaster, war and terrorism, and the flows of migrants that these create. This is particularly the case in relation to Muslim youth. While the life chances of youth in some countries are very badly affected by war and violence, particularly those in Palestine, Syria, and Iraq, there are many more who are experiencing the same unprecedented progress as everyone else. The international media bombards us daily with negative images of young Muslims, whether as the perpetrators of violence, as jihadists, warriors, and terrorists, or as its victims, fleeing bombed-out cities or grieving the loss of loved ones. In relation to the Arab Spring, the lasting perception again is of Muslim youth involved in violence. Protesters being beaten by security forces, tear gas canisters being thrown, and of the resulting chaos in Yemen, Libya, and Syria. Muslim immigrant populations living in the West, whether recent refugees or second-generation nationals, are similarly often portrayed as unemployed, marginalized, and disaffected, and susceptible as a result to recruitment by terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These images shape and perpetuate these misperceptions of Muslim youth. Such misperceptions serve the political agendas of some right-wing politicians in the West who generate support by stirring up nationalistic fears. The successful Brexit campaign in the UK demonstrated just how effective this approach can be. The dissemination of negative stereotypes of Muslim youth as violent also plays into the hands of extremists in the Muslim world. They similarly seek to generate support by promoting belief in an unbridgeable divide between the Islamic world and the West. The terrorist attacks perpetrated by these extremists on Western targets then deepens further these negative stereotypes. Islamophobia is a very real concern for many Muslim youth growing up in the West who are experiencing growing and increasingly open hostility. These dynamics present a serious challenge for our young generation, both for those in Muslim minority countries and for those in the Middle East at the heart of the conflicts. The disaffection and associated violence that is presented as a trend is in fact an exception to the overall development that is benefiting young Muslims across the world. As mentioned, there are many Muslim majority countries with high and rising levels of human development. A quarter of countries classified by the UNDP as having high human development are Muslim majority ones. And this proportion would be significantly higher if calculated according to population. The improvements that have been experienced in these countries over the past generation means that their young people today are considerably better off than their parents. Muslim youth living in Muslim minority countries in the West enjoy even higher levels of development, and those benefiting from the available opportunities vastly outnumber those very few who reject them in favor of fanaticism and violence. Misperceptions persist, however, reflecting in part the very real gulf between the West and the Muslim world. This gulf has arisen due to complex historical and geopolitical factors, as well as the manipulation by extremists on both sides who seek to gain by this polarization. Some of the issues involved currently appear almost intractable, particularly the worsening conflicts in Palestine, Syria, and Iraq, in which Western interests and agendas play a key role. The escalating abuses being perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinian people generates deep and justified grievances among Muslims throughout the world. Competition over access to the region's oil and gas resources is another key factor that creates further mistrust of the motives of the West. On the other side, the upsurge in terrorist attacks on Western targets and the killing of civilians has exacerbated existing antipathy towards the Muslim world and the erroneous association of Islam with this violence. It is absolutely crucial that the moderate majority on both sides of the divide take the initiative to promote reconciliation. This is necessary in part to ensure that Muslim youth in Muslim minority countries can pursue their lives without fear and prejudice. It is also vital to prevent further escalation that only feeds the agendas of extremists on both sides. Bridging the divide is a difficult and complex task that will require substantial efforts on both sides. As I discussed some years ago in an address to the World Muslim Leadership Forum, for our part in the Muslim world, we must work on building at least 3 bridges. These bridges must be built internally between our leaders and those they govern, and externally, both among ourselves and between ourselves and the West. The bridges must all be strong and should reinforce each other. Together, they can contribute to reducing this key area of conflict and ensure a more peaceful future world. The first and most critical is the bridge between Muslims and their government. In order to strengthen further the human development gains that have been made in many Muslim countries, there is a need for greater progress in relation to political participation. This could help address some of the sources of dissatisfaction that were expressed in the Arab Spring. These youth-led uprisings have broadly failed to fulfill the aspirations of those involved and have instead resulted in considerable further instability and violence. This in turn has created massive new refugee flows and contributed to the emergence of new terrorist groups. While the broader conflicts in the region can only be resolved at the international level, the aspiration of the region's youth for greater political inclusion can only be met locally. Local actors must also take the lead in building the second bridge, which entails greater cooperation between Muslim countries. This will in turn contribute to the ability of Muslim countries to manage their relations with the West more effectively. Greater coordination between Muslim countries will also enable us to play a more effective role in responding to the conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere, and to the terrorism they help to generate. Organizations like the OIC are making progress in developing better communication and greater collaboration between Muslim countries. But serious internal divisions and rivalries remain, which themselves, of course, play a key role in exacerbating the conflicts in the region. The bridge between the Muslim world and the West can ultimately only be built through a resolution of these difficult conflicts. However intractable these appear, greater efforts must be made on both sides, both to seek more effective dialogue and to address the root causes. If this is unrealistic in the present circumstances, as appears to be the case in Palestine and in Syria, at the very least, ways must be sought to avoid further escalation and to do more to protect the civilian victims of these conflicts. In this regard, one useful focus for attention could be on trying to promote greater adherence to international humanitarian law on all sides in the Syrian conflict. The challenges faced by our youth as they confront our future world will be immense. The development gains that have benefited many in the past decades are in danger of being eroded by the sheer weight of numbers, as many developing countries experience a youth bulge. Efforts must be made to protect these gains and promote further development, as we are doing here in Malaysia through Vision 2020, with its focus on strengthening human capital and further expanding the middle class. Shrinking employment opportunities, whether from growing demographic pressures or technological advances, also present a significant set of risks for today's youth. If this generation and subsequent ones are to flourish, greater efforts must be made to develop appropriate education strategies that take into account the likely impact of technological advances, and much greater investment must be made into the expansion of alternative employment options. Finally, the widening gulf between the Muslim world and the West and the violence this generates must be effectively addressed. Otherwise, our youth in the Muslim minority countries will be increasingly vulnerable to prejudice and hostility, while the hopes and dreams of the next generation of youth at the center of these conflicts will continue to be destroyed. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, you will not shy away from some of these difficult issues as you proceed with your discussion during the conference. With that hope in mind, it now gives me great pleasure to declare the third World Conference on Islamic Thought and Civilization open with the powerful words, Bismillahi Allahu Akbar.
Menjunjung kasih Tuanku. Ladies and gentlemen, that marks the official opening of the third World Conference on Islamic Thought and Civilization. Ampun Tuanku, with your kind permission, we will now proceed with the distinguished session, where we have three eminent speakers to share with us their thoughts on the future world, the theme of this conference. With that, may we now invite the three eminent speakers to take their seats on the stage. Sheikh Dr. Muhammad Yahya An-Ninawi, founder and director of Medina Institute, USA. Professor Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali, founding CEO, International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, Malaysia. And Dr. Bilal Phillips, founder and Chancellor, Islamic Online University. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the speakers will have 20 minutes each to present their thoughts. And it is now my pleasure to formally introduce the speakers. We begin with Sheikh Dr. Muhammad Yahya An-Ninawi, founder and director of Medina Institute, USA. Dr. Muhammad bin Yahya Al-Husayni An-Ninawi was born and raised in Syria. He began his studies under his father, Sayyid Yahya Rahimahullah, and many of the senior scholars of Aleppo, Syria, at the time, in the early days. He spent memorizing the glorious Quran and acquiring knowledge in many of the Islamic disciplines, such as Tawhid, Hanafi and Shafi'i fiqh, Usul, and Ihsan. Besides attending the faculty of Usuluddin at Al-Azhar University, Sheikh Muhammad dwelled further into the fields of Hadith and Tawheed under the tutelage of many of the foremost scholars in Syria, Hijaz, Morocco, Egypt, and also elsewhere. Sheikh Muhammad focuses on reviving the call back to basics, i.e. the Quran and Sunnah, in addition to teaching tolerance, peace, and compassion. Sheikh Muhammad is the senior in-residence scholar at Medina Masjid and Institute in Atlanta, Georgia since the year 2000. He has authored many books in the sciences of Tawheed, Hadith, and Usul, some of which are being translated and published into English. Sheikh Muhammad is the founding director of Planet Mercy and Medina Institute and Seminary in the UK, South Africa, and Canada, and the USA. Let us now listen to his thoughts on what the tradition of Islam and the texts have to say about the future world. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sheikh Dr. Muhammad Yahya An-Ninawi.
Sultan Nazreen Shah, the Sultan of the great state of Perak, Malaysia, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. First of all, it gives me a great pleasure. It's a privilege for me to be here in Perak again. I've been telling the Honorable Chief Minister that I feel like a Perakian. I actually told His Royal Highness today that as well. Let's go straight to the topic. I think I view the challenges that we have, and I think the Sultan's speech sort of went through a couple of the things that I really wanted to sort of focus on, and I'm glad that he did that in a much better way. I think there are three issues that we need to focus on. Number one, as a challenge of our future as Muslims. Number one, international violence in the name of Islam. Number two, atheism within Muslim societies. And number three, education, which happens to be the problem and the solution, in my view. A lot of these things are beyond what we can do, let's say, as theologians and even some governments, because the picture is much more complex, as you've heard from His Royal Highness earlier. But there are things that we can do, and I'm going to focus on four possible scenarios of how we react to all these three challenges that we face, whether from international violence or atheism or education. First scenario that we may come out sort of focusing on after this is the back to the past scenario. I distinguish between back to the past versus back to basics. This is back to the past, and which means obviously when the future of Muslims is discussed by most, if not all Muslims, most tend to resort to the historical memory of the righteous Khilafah, or we call Al-Khilafah Rashida by the Sahaba radiyallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'een, when the Prophet's principles and moral leadership and shura, which is our Islamic version of democracy, were practiced. The Muslim world still attempts to return to its historical memory of grandeur. The issue that obviously it must be contextualized, which means obviously there's an oversimplification of the matter and a lack of sophistication in studying the post-prophetic era sufficiently, rather than just romanticizing about it in an oversimplistic way. The era of the righteous khulafa, or the righteous leaders, was not challenge-free. Suffice to say that there were military conflicts in at least 3 out of the 4, and 3 out of the 4 righteous caliphs, may Allah be well pleased with them, were assassinated. The fundamental error of misplaced concretism is due to a superficial historical reading of the era. Therefore, the notion to replicate it exactly means to take this period out of history and decontextualize it. Obviously, as this return is not a contextual return, but a reiteration of the psycho-social, economic, religious, and political particulars of the 7th century. Hence, such an attempt back to the past may end up in efforts that have no realistic results or uncertain results emerging. Traditionally, this memory of an idealized past was used for nation building, and that's great. Recently, in recent history, it's been used as part of the larger quest to create or preserve political tyranny with religious labels. The attempt to return to the imagined past, wherein a political, social, economic Islam gains supremacy, if it's out of context, it's not going to actually lead to good, positive results, and regardless, it will swim against the modernist and dominant Western stream. Conflicts will eventually be worse, not just with the West, with the context of what we're doing. And that's where, again, institutions, Islamic academic institutions come and present theories that are practical and visions and hypotheses about how we can go about these things and how we have a contextual return, and that's what I call back to basics rather than back to the past. The second and third scenario that I see is based on the sort of theory that Fukuyama and Huntington discussed. Francis Fukuyama, the author of The End of History and The Last Man, obviously, in which he argued the progression of human history as a struggle between ideologies is largely at an end, with the world settling on liberal democracy after the end of the Cold War. Fukuyama predicted the eventual global triumph of political and economic liberalism, and with that, there's little room for religious and cultural differences. What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracies and the values that come with it as the final form of human government. Obviously, Fukuyama looks at history that should be viewed as an evolutionary process, and it's coming to the end. Pessimism is warranted, according to him, because humanity's future is the inability to control technology, for example. The end of history means, obviously, that the liberal democracies are is the final form of human governments. There can be no progression from liberal democracies to an alternative system. Another theory comes, and again, these may be theories that have been written about maybe 30 years ago or so, but when you look at the world today, you see a lot of that in action. So I'm not saying that they're actually being manifested, but I'm saying that it requires a look. Another one is by Samuel P. Huntington. In 1996, he wrote about the clash of civilization and the remaking of world order. Obviously, he identified several major civilizations in the world. He identified about 7 to 8. One of them is Western, Latin American, obviously Islamic, Hindu, Orthodox, Japanese, and African. The cultural organization contrasts the contemporary world with the classical notion of sovereign states. To understand the current and future conflict, cultural rifts must be understood, and culture rather than state must be accepted. Culture rather than state must be accepted as the reason for war, he argues. He argues that Western nations will lose predominance if they fail to recognize the irreconcilable nature of cultural tensions. Huntington, obviously, in an interesting thing that he wrote back in the 90s, that Ukraine will be divided along the cultural line between the more Catholic Western Ukraine and the Orthodox Eastern Russian Ukraine. So coming to the second scenario, then, with these two theories in mind, the clash of civilization, end of history, what we may be seeing, second scenario, post these challenges, how the Ummah sort of moves into an intensifying inter and intra-Islamic divisions. Divisions within the Islamic world heightens, war with the West, among Islamic nations and among sects within Islam will be primary. Sure, this is a slow progress, but nevertheless lethal. While the first scenario is driven by the desire to return to the tradition, this scenario is based on the playing out of various contradictions. These include civilization and nation, and civilizations in conflict. The intra-Islamic tension is between Islam as a civilization and Islam within the nation state. That is, one cannot have an Islamic republic or kingdom. Islam must be free of all national shackles. It is this contradiction that worries leaders throughout the Muslim majority countries. In a true Islamic caliphate, they would no longer have power. Superordinate power is a threat to all local powers, regardless what they are, even if it is more appropriate for economy, policy, or anything else. Question comes then in this: can pan-Islam be created? Or will the tension between civilization and nation state always exist? Or is it possible that there is a way out of this dichotomy? And that's where, again, academic Islamic institutions need to come and put out all these theories, and we need to dissect them to the minute possible details in light of our tradition, jurisprudence, and usul. After all, is this what ISIL or ISIS attempted to do? But in such scenario, does the rest of the Muslim world, for example, agrees to an ultra-Puritan form of Salafi Islam, for example? Another thing that one needs to look into, versus the actual Khilafah al-Rashida scenario. The inter-Islamic tension is between Islam as a civilization in conflict with the Judeo-Christian world nowadays. Again, all these things are theories. They don't need to be really true, but they're there and they're actualized. By most measures, the Islamic world falls short on most economic and social indicators, yet Muslims and Westerners offer very different explanations for these shortfalls. From the Western perspective, the Islamic world has failed to modernize, secularize, and innovate. The Islamic response, however, is focused less on internal issues and more on external ones. And that's a problem at the beginning, but again, principally how the West has intervened in the Islamic world's natural development, that is a problem that still lingers. From this perspective, colonialism has created economic, political, and social change through violence. Thus, you hear the grand and often polemical calls for justice from the Muslim majority countries. With the assumption that the current world order based on culture of conflict, violence, and war persists, Muslims, or many Muslims, will act within it and most likely will respond to its violent aspects with some kind of extremism, whether violent or non-violent. It's a simple fact. Violence will always breed violence, right or wrong. But in this scenario, the Muslim world stands to lose, certainly in the short run. Muslims aspiring for justice in a world that is governed by violence and conflict will probably not get anywhere given the asymmetry in wealth, power, means, and technology. After the loss and bloodshed and destruction, the medium term, 50 to 100 years, will see the rise of softer, syncretic Sufi side. As a response to that, however, deeper issues will still persist. They're not resolved, since it was violence instead of productive peace building that drove the changes within Muslim societies. As a result, the cycles of poverty, alienation, and despair will continue. The scenario of war of violence has only one outcome: more violence, more conflict, and decline. Another scenario, or the third scenario, then obviously, as the Prophet ﷺ told us in the authentic narrative, that you will be following the Christians and the Jews. Obviously, we all Muslims, like Christians and Jews, are the children of Abraham. We all come from that Abrahamic umbrella. Islam's temporal future, hence, can be predictable accordingly. Muslims will slowly emerge from the current situation and enter a modernist or a Western phase of socio-political era. The Islamic world will move and join the European 20th century enlightenment of modern liberal democracy and all of its values, or create its own similar version. Just as the West went from ancient to classical to feudal to modern, and now entering a period of unlimited choice and the boundarylessness of postmodernism, challenging stable notions of truth, nature, reality, and self through robotics, genetics, space travel, feminism, multiculturalism, the Islamic world will also leave the feudal and enter the so-called postmodern or the modern era. The current crises and the turmoil that we see in Muslim-majority countries, whether it's the Middle East, North Africa, or otherwise, seen from a long-term macro view, are minor reactions to this trajectory. However, seen with far less of a grand vision, the march into a linear-shaped global scenario where just moving after the footsteps of our Abrahamic faith brothers continues to have major setbacks, regardless. First, within obviously Muslim-majority countries, is the despotism, obviously, of the majority of Muslim countries on all levels, at least political and religious, or very fragile democracies. And that also is on the religious institutions as well, from an academic point of view. The second is the post-9/11 world order. The world has changed after the unfortunate events of 9/11. And probably within our lifetimes, it's not going to go back to the same way it was before 9/11. And we need to be able, many of us are still in denial that this is just a temporary phase that will go. It doesn't seem like it is a temporary phase, and we need to deal with it accordingly. Third has been the continued violence in many areas in the world involving Muslims, such as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, as the Royal Highness, the Sultan mentioned, Kashmir, Afghanistan, and now you can add Yemen, Syria, Libya, Mali, Nigeria, and many more to come, largely depending on the outcome of the Syrian conflict. If the Syrian conflict is not restricted or is not contained, international violence will spread a lot more in the world in the very name of Islam. Fourth, right or wrong, obviously, Islam is a religion of violence, is the language of the inarticulate. Islam is an articulate faith, and violence is not viable with its codes or ethics, but that's just a picture that's out there. Fourth, obviously, are the divisions of class and gender and the urban patterns of poverty, alienation, unemployment, disempowerment found in the Islamic world, especially with respect to the youth, and His Royal Highness mentioned that as well. Muslim institutions, universities, and governments must better understand the needs, hopes, and dreams of young Muslims. Many young Muslims see no opportunity for themselves and do not feel they have control over their lives or a stake in their nation's future. This is fueled by the gap between the teachings and directions offered by mosques and religious institutions, and obviously then the harsh urban reality with its global village sentiments. Such pessimism leads to disengagement. We risk losing generations of young Muslims to apathy and extremism in an either violent or non-violent form. When young people lack opportunity, view religious teachings as irrelevant or inapplicable, they grow confused and lose their sense of belonging socially, religiously, and politically. This can spill into hostility to the state and society if their state uses religion to justify its policies or legitimacy. Many young people without proper religious foundation will drift into anti-religion and even hostile atheism. Outside of the Islamic world, equally relevant are the following factors. First, uneven globalization. That means obviously few immediate and midterm benefits to poorer nations. Second is the continued perceived hypocrisy amongst the Western powers, such as the invasion of Iraq and Libya, and now the Syrian and Yemeni crisis, where hypocrisy was hidden behind managerialism or misinformation instead of corrective measures to rescue from a violence-torn, failed state inevitability. Third is the intrinsic problem with the widely promoted theory about the clash of civilizations due to the cultural construction of the non-West as inferior, that is, direct, structural, and epistemological violence. And fourth is the hyper-technological advancement via robotics, genetics, nanotechnology that make catch-up practically impossible. In this scenario, the Islamic world's future is contoured by the rise of the West from colonial empire to developmentalism, and now to the empire of globalization. The Islamic world's trajectory is defined and limited by the West's technological, economic, political, and definitional dominance. And today, a lot of things are about definitions. Allahu Akbar means something, and Allahu Akbar may mean something else. Islam and an Islamic state within yourself may mean something, and then a definition may make it something else. And that's something that we need to look at from an epistemological point of view. Along with the restricted parameters, there's another challenge within this scenario: Islamic education. It's the problem and the challenge, unfortunately. Curriculum, methodology, depth and breadth of material taught, and much more must be reviewed, critically so. Our academic institutions and even mosques need to be, well, maybe mosques to a lesser degree, but our Islamic academic institutions must be a place where the minds clash. We must create the environment where minds clash. That's the only way that we can actually have the best coming out of all this. It cannot be just a unilateral or one understanding or parroting. Scholarship can never be merely regurgitated information. And that's something we need to look into. In order for religious institutions to produce scholarship, that's how it remains relevant. We must take a critical look inside, obviously. Islamic education requires the best and the brightest of young minds. And Muslim majority societies need to create an environment, a post-studies environment, socioeconomically, where it's conducive to thriving and dynamic scholarship. New technologies exacerbate the possibilities of enhanced multiplicities. The power of the internet and social media removes the power of interpretation from religious groups, institutions, and traditional scholarship to individuals, leading too far to individualized religiosity. And again, that you see that within also a Western context, from an organized religion to an individualized religiosity. There's a good thing and bad thing in these things, and again, that's where think tanks like this come in and suggest. This possibility of more individualism is unsympathetically understood by the traditionalists on all sides and national bureaucrats who paint all attempts of individualistic and syncretic Islam as unpatriotic. He who owns the means of knowledge, the right to define, is at the heart of the battle within Islam, and indeed the world. And it remains the major world's powers that are the defining agent. If Islamic institutions do not take a proper part at this, we will not succeed. Another thing also, obviously, a mixed scenario of all these things. In other words, where we go, instead of back to the past, we go back to basics. And back to basics where we incorporate not just the information that that Muslims need to have, but moving from an information to transformation phase, moving from an information to character building, to realization. What we need to have is not just people who memorize information. We need to have young, good sons and good daughters, good fathers and good sisters and good mothers, productive members of society, and take from our wealthy history and wealthy tradition and put it in a context where we can actually face the challenges. The challenges are tremendous, but they all start with education, and they end with education. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we would like to hear a lot more from you, but the time does not permit, and we have to move on. And definitely some food for thought there, and we move on to the next speaker, and he is Professor Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali, who is the founding CEO of the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, Malaysia, since 2007 until now, and who's also a world-renowned scholar in his field of specialization. He served as Professor of Islamic Law and Jurisprudence at the International Islamic University, Malaysia, from 1985 to 2004, and was the Dean of the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTAC, from 2004 to 2006. Currently, he is Senior Fellow at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS, Malaysia, as well as a Senior Fellow of the Academy of Sciences of Afghanistan, as well as a Senior Fellow of the Royal Academy of Jordan. He serves on the International Advisory Board of 13 academic journals published in Malaysia, USA, Canada, Kuwait, India, Australia, and Pakistan. Professor Kamal has served as a member and chairman of the Constitution Review Commission of Afghanistan in 2003, as well as a UN consultant on constitutional reforms in Afghanistan, the Maldives, and Iraq, and currently advises the UN on a new constitution for Somalia. Professor Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali, whose expertise is in the legal sphere, can probably shed some light on what he thinks are the implications and relevance of Islamic law to the future world. Please welcome Professor Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم. Your Royal Highness Sultan Nazrin Shah, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, good morning. I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers today for granting me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. Speaking about the future world, how we characterize it must involve an element of speculation. I will say a few words about how we understand the trends of the future, then reflect on how we characterize Islam's approach to ilm, to higher education, and whether it has the resources to embrace the future. The age of knowledge, which is already with us, has been characterized with three mega trends: globalization, technological change, and demographic change. As the world becomes more and more interconnected, there will be greater competition at all levels. The way we learn, discover, innovate, and deliver will change, and the impacts of those changes will hit home faster and will also impact our culture and the values of our generation. Global mobility of students and scholars and educators will increase. There will be fewer greater universities that will dominate. The smaller ones will probably merge, and some may even close. World standard higher education and skills will be in greater demand. Degrees will be evaluated against employability. Technological changes will impact all aspects of our life, not only economics in society, but the sciences in civilization. Automation, digital technologies, and digital disruptions will create massive unemployment, social exclusion, and discontent to some extent, especially among the youth. Increasing in systematic unpredictability will be the character of the time we are coming into. This is because the individuals and organizations will have ever more capabilities to become constructive, or the opposite of that, to be destructive. Democratization of knowledge and massive online availability of information will characterize the age of knowledge. There will be greater emphasis on creative and evaluative abilities of our institutions of higher education and on every and all those involved in the delivery of higher knowledge. Traditional patterns of examination will have to change and gear toward nurturing the creative and analytical abilities of students. There is also the opposite view, that the faster movements and rapidity of all around us will once again draw our attention to the lecture hall and to the importance of the critical, analytical thinking students and scholars. What we are currently generating are competent surfers, short on deeper understanding. And this will generate fresh demands on institutions of our higher learning. The reports even say that universities will ban smartphones and laptops in classrooms, and the seminar room will be again in focus of our attention. There will be this opposite view also emphasized. There will be no higher education revolution as such, but there will be evolutionary development in many, many areas, more specialized learning, and providers of higher education will have to respond to the demands for greater specializations. The demographic changes is characterized by aging populations in youthful population also. There will be shifts in family size, and also social norms will alter what we expect and can do in education and research. Innovation will be in demand. There will be food and energy shortages and challenges that will generate demands on institutions of higher learning and will preoccupy the deliverers of knowledge to come up with relevant responses. Now, coming to the second part of my presentation, how do we characterize the Islamic approach to higher education, to ilm, to knowledge? And if we know how the characteristics of our approach, then perhaps we can perhaps know better how to prepare ourselves. There are some connectivities between ilm. Knowledge in Islam is interconnected with divine guidance, divine revelation. There is also a nexus connectivity between knowledge and the personality, the character and the akhlaq of the individual. Knowledge must go hand in hand to merge with these aspects. Islam's approach to knowledge is formulated and shaped by the guidance of the Quran and Sunnah. And there is emphasis in the Quran on knowledge that is espoused with understanding and insight, fahm and tafakkuh. And the pursuit of knowledge and ilm is a lifelong commitment of every Muslim. اطلبوا العلم من المهد إلى اللحد. Acquisition of knowledge knows no particular time. And also, there is no cultural barrier to the pursuit of knowledge. اطلبوا العلم ولو كان بالسين. The pursuit of knowledge may take you to China. China was not the place of religious knowledge, of course, but that does signify that we are not really bound by the barriers of ethnicity and culture. Islam's approach to knowledge is an open approach, of course, under the guidance of divine revelation and a structure of values that characterize the moral and spiritual teachings of Islam. It is otherwise an open approach. That al-hikmatu dwallatul mu'min, that wisdom is the lost property of a believer. He is entitled to pursue it wherever he finds it. And the pursuit of knowledge in Islam is not one of static knowledge. It must continue to increase itself and generate new knowledge. وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا. This is the supplication Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directed the Prophet. Say to increase me in knowledge. And the Prophet ﷺ repeated that supplication, but added one or two other characteristics. And that is beneficial knowledge that brings benefit to humanity. A knowledge that is also the source of correct action. Allahumma anfi'ni bima 'allamtani. Allah, enable me to take benefit by what you enable me to learn. وَعَلِّمْنِي مَا يَنْفَعُنِي, and teach me that which will bring me in humanity benefit. وَزِدْنِي عِلْمًا, and increase my knowledge. That characterizes Islam's approach to knowledge, the pursuit of beneficial knowledge. These destructive knowledge, the kind of, that brings the increased emphasis on ever more destructive instruments. This is not part of our approach to ilm. Islam also advises us to take position over issues in decision-making only in the light of knowledge. وَلَا تَقْفِ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ. Do not take position over that of which you do not have knowledge. In the verse follows, إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلٌّ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. The hearing, the sight, and the intellect, they are all responsible. And this signifies that these are the instruments of our knowledge, sense perception, and this is the Quranic approach to knowledge. It is experimental knowledge gained through sense perception. But sense perception is prone to, susceptible to error. And that error is corrected by rationality in aql. But as we know, aql can itself be susceptible to error. Above that is the guidance of wahya. Muhammad Iqbal, in his book, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, characterized the Quran. The Quran was anti-classical. The ulama were moved by Hellenistic and Greek heritage to knowledge to such an extent that for 200 years they did not reflect that the Quran added another dimension, inductive and experimental knowledge. There is so much emphasis in the Quran on reflection and on the world around us, on the kind of engagement to the life as we have, that the intellectual approach, the kind of theoretical approach of the Greeks was enhanced by the Quranic approach to ilm. And the all-inclusive approach of Islam to ilm is once again manifested in the words of the Prophet of Islam, that people are of two kinds. They are either the learned or the learner. And there is no good, وَلَا خَيْرَ فِي سِوَاهُمَا. If they are not engaged in one or the other in pursuit of knowledge, you do not expect good to come out of them. There is, of course, sanctity attached to the pursuit of knowledge. A person who goes out in pursuit of knowledge is engaged in an aspect of ibadah, in jihad, until he returns. طَلَبُ الْعِلْمِ كَفَارَةٌ لِمَا مَضَى. The pursuit of knowledge is a kafara, is an expiation, an atonement for the misdeed that precedes it. And how we now characterize Islam's resources to embrace the future. Of course, the teachings of the Quran and Sunnah, especially the Aam in the Mutlaq of the Quran, the general and the absolute, the Quranic directives on justice, on moral virtue, on amana, on husn al-khulq, on generosity and compassion. These are the general, the Aam of the Quran, that it is not confined to a particular time segment. They are for all times. And the future world that we embrace must also bear these characteristics if they were to be characterized Islamic. The fundamentals of Iman in Islam are not liable to change. We are also advised by the guidance of the Quran and Sunnah to be open to knowledge from all directions that we can get it, beneficial knowledge, but that we have our own standing in the world. Islamic civilization has its own characteristics. Hilm, Subat, and Sabr, these are the teachings of the Quran, that we are open, but we do not dissolve ourselves in the different other. We contribute and we learn, but we do not lose our own groundings and characteristics into those of other civilizations. Islam's teaching on moderation, on the middle path of wasatiyya will tell us, will guide us the correct orientation on how to entertain the mega trends, the fast and rapid world that is all around us. Islam's approach is, of course, is holistic. It combines the knowledge of aql and of wahya, and there is the guidelines of the Sharia. All of them are geared towards the advancement of human welfare. There is a fresh emphasis in the Islamic traditions. Usul al-fiqh is a mother discipline, but there is a fresh interest in the maqasid al-sharia, the advancement of knowledge of the higher objectives of the sharia. This is likely to develop in the future. Unlike the ijma in qiyas, analogical reasoning, in consensus, general consensus, in the past and the precedent, of course, they will be with us, but we must develop them in the ways that can guide us into the future. There will be fresh demand on original ijtihad. Ijtihad is, of course, in two varieties. Ijtihad intiqa'i and ijtihad insha'i. Ijtihad insha'i, that is creative ijtihad, that comes up with new solutions to unprecedented issues and problems. Islam's resources also can be found in its teachings on tajdeed and islah. Tajdeed is revival and renewal of our approaches, of our resources to face the new changes. Our universities, what must they do? They should develop their resources to respond to the new challenges. They should pay greater attention, in addition to their grounding in traditional knowledge, to equip those who, their graduates, with the greater knowledge of the new sciences, the unfinished agenda of the universities to bring closer together the traditional knowledge and modern knowledge. This will continue. We have to respond to the challenges of society in a more meaningful and relevant way. The universities will face the demand to train and to nurture, to graduate ulamas and muftis and teachers who are better equipped to come up with relevant responses that can guide our generation into the future, that we can respond to new issues through the guidance and knowledge of our tradition, of the knowledge that we gain from the past heritage. We also try to balance existing knowledge with the challenges of the future. But we do not become reactive, but to excel from within. The kind of developments that have been taking place in the Western world, especially relating to Islam, the negative kind of trends that we have seen, Islamophobia, political Islam, and the deviant teaching coming from different corners, the ISIS, for example, in these other deviant groups, they will also impact the institutions of higher learning. The kind of demand that will be generated by these trends, we will have to be able to respond to them in a meaningful way, in a relevant way. We will have to train our students and teachers and ulama to engage not only with these negative trends, to generate correct understanding, and also to equip the new generation, the youth, to realize the kind of influences that we are facing. We will have to come to terms with these new realities and respond to them in a way that shows that Islam is not reactive, but as it has contributed throughout in history to world civilization, that it has the resources to continue to be creative, to be relevant, and to entertain the future with confidence, with the kind of equipped with the great wisdom of the tradition, and also the openness that we have to the realities around us. Thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali. And finally, we have Dr. Bilal Phillips, born Dennis Bradley Phillips. He's a Jamaican Canadian Muslim who converted to Islam in 1972. He is a scholar, a speaker, and an author who lives in Qatar. He completed a BA from the Islamic University of Medina, an MA from King Saud University in Riyadh, and a PhD in Islamic theology from the University of Wales in 1994. Dr. Bilal spent 10 years teaching Islamic studies at an Islamic high school in Riyadh, and another 18 years lecturing in Arabic and Islamic studies at the American University in Dubai. Also, the Islamic Studies Academy in Doha, Qatar, the Knowledge International University of Riyadh, and Preston International College, Chennai, India. Dr. Bilal Phillips has written, translated, and commented on over 50 published books on various Islamic topics and presented Islamic programs on Riyadh Channel 2 TV, Sharia TV, Peace TV, Huda TV, Islam Channel UK, and The Dean Show, Chicago, USA, and Guide US TV from Washington, USA. Phillips founded an Islamic online university in Qatar, which in only 7 years since its inception, over 270 students have registered from 228 different countries around the world. With that, he may be able to share with us his thoughts about the intercultural cooperation between the different communities of the future world. Please welcome Dr. Bilal Phillips.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulil Kareem, wa ala alihi wa ashabihi, wa man istanna bi sunnatihi ila yawmiddin. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. His Excellency and our distinguished guests and distinguished organizers of this program, this conference, a conference which addresses, at this point, the future. And a conference which has asked me to speak about my vision of the future. Reality, of course, is that today's world is a product of yesterday's world. And that world that we're talking about in the future will be a product of this world. And the 21st century, which we are currently in, coming out of the 20th century, has, in my view, a picture for us of the rise of Islam. That picture, for me personally, when I moved to Sabah in 1964 with my parents, a non-Muslim, and I spent 3 years of my life there in Sabah. And during those 3 years, my mother adopted an Indonesian boy who was born and raised in Sabah. He was my contact with Islam. But that contact was so clouded, I didn't realize I was in contact with Islam. In Kota Kinabalu, where I went to school, both of my parents were teachers. They were with the Colombo Plan to help in the development of educational institutions in Malaysia. I didn't see Islam in the society. There were no women walking the streets in hijab. The masjids, there were none actually in Kota Kinabalu city. The colonial masters had kept mosques out of the center. The only thing that I saw of Islam directly which I didn't recognize at the time, was my brother, adopted, prostrating in his room. Sometimes myself, my brother, and my sister would open his room, and we would go in and we find him there on the ground prostrating. And we were wondering to ourselves, what is he doing? Because we are Christians, we'd never seen anybody prostrate. And one thing I noticed also was that during the month of what was Ramadan, my mother used to get up early in the morning to prepare suhoor. I didn't know it was suhoor, but she would prepare an early morning meal for him. And whenever she cooked a meal in which there was pork, we are Christians, we ate pork, and just for your knowledge, it doesn't taste that bad. She would cook for him fish. She was very careful to make sure he didn't do anything living with us which went against his religious traditions. But we didn't understand. And it wasn't until I accepted Islam in 1972, 8 years later, and I learned how to make salah, sujood, I said, that's what he is, a Muslim. Islam was just an unknown quantity in my life from the time I was born in Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica. I grew up in Toronto. My family migrated to Toronto. My parents went to University of Toronto. There was no Islam. Nothing mentioned about Islam. The only thing I think I remember, there was a song called Ahab the Arab, Sheik of the Burning Sands. That's about as close, I guess, as we got to Islam, or what Islam is, associated with the Arabs, riding in off the desert on a camel with a sword in one hand and the Quran in the other. The 70s. In the early part of the 70s, I accepted Islam and went to Medina shortly after accepting Islam to study Arabic and Islamic studies in Medina University. My consciousness of Islam grew. In the 70s, information about Islam started to reach the news. Whether it was the Iranian Revolution, connected to Islam, or the Meccan incident, connected to Islam, or the crushing of the Muslim uprising in Syria, Homs and Hama, there was an increasing awareness about Islam in the media, which was connected at the same time with an awakening in the Muslim world. There was no mention earlier in the news. All of a sudden, by the late 70s, early 80s, now Islam is starting to be mentioned more and more often. And issues about Islam started to arise. In this period of time, Muslims had no control over the media. the media could say whatever it wished, whether TV, magazines, books, etc. And it was at this time that Allah blessed Muslims, humankind, with the internet, the beginnings of the internet. The internet, which, according to those who discovered it, was an accident. If you Google internet history, they will tell you the founders found it by accident. While they were studying the origins of matter, trying to find what they called the God particle, Higgs boson particle, they call it the God particle, which made up everything. We don't need God to explain why we're here. God is a particle that made everything. In the course of trying to find this God particle, they discovered accidentally the internet. And the internet now leveled the playing field. So anyone could say something about Islam. So all of a sudden, knowledge about Islam started to be spread on a greater and greater scale. In that period of time, I was in Riyadh, and the first Gulf War took place. I experienced the Scuds, missiles sent by Saddam hitting Riyadh. First time I'd ever been in a war zone. And at the same time, alhamdulillah, immediately after the Gulf War was over, first Gulf War, which people saw, Muslims saw as a tragedy. 500,000 American soldiers came to Saudi Arabia, trampling holy soil. They didn't go to Mecca and Medina, so it really wasn't holy soil. But that's how it was presented in some elements of the Muslim media. In the process of transporting these American soldiers back to America, alhamdulillah, I was asked to lead a team of du'at, a da'wah team, a group, who were given permission to set up a da'wah tent in the middle of the biggest base for the American troops to be processed out of Saudi Arabia and back to the US. This is with the permission of the American forces and the Saudi forces. And alhamdulillah, in the course of 6 months, as they were processed out of the country, from our da'wah center, in the middle of their base, more than 3,000 Americans accepted Islam. 3,000 Americans who came to Saudi Arabia with the craziest ideas about what Islam was. But alhamdulillah, in that short space of time, people from all walks of life accepted Islam, as they just found out what Islam actually was. What did it actually represent? They went inside of mosques. We took them inside of Saudi homes. We just gave them the experience of what it is to be a Muslim. And of course, many others didn't necessarily accept Islam, but at least they were enlightened. And our purpose was there to just enlighten people about Islam. It wasn't necessarily to convert, but some 3,000 chose to convert. And in the 90s, we also saw other tragedies coming out of the Gulf War. It was followed by the tragedy in Bosnia. Bosnia, where the world stood by and thousands of our brothers and sisters were slaughtered. There, the roots of what we now know today as the Qaeda were born. Born out of a righteous struggle, a struggle to protect our brothers and sisters there in Bosnia. Some of those who fought in that struggle took another direction afterwards, but it was born there. In this period of time, the 90s, Islamophobia took on a new perspective. It was beginning from back in the 80s, but in the 90s, the Runnymede report from the UK confirmed that it actually existed. People before that were denying, saying there's no such thing, something made up. Muslims just want to get in, to be recognized. After homophobia, then we had Islamophobia. But the British government said it's real. And its sources were basically politicians, politics, and the media. These were the main two that were identified. Politicians who now found a new bogeyman that could be pointed at as the cause of the problems of the country. Muslims stood out. Of course, back in the 60s, 50s, it was communism. Communism was the bad guys. Whatever problems we have, blame it on the communists. After communism fell, lost its place, there wasn't any more scapegoats. Then came the Muslims. We became the scapegoat. So Islamophobia was born. Politicians used it as an excuse. The media, to sell their newspapers and to get viewers for their various shows, buy their magazines, use Islamophobia for their own financial gain. However, during the 90s, in the course of blaming Muslims and mentioning Muslims more and more people around the world became conscious of Islam. And we see in that period also a rise in the awareness of Islam here in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Turkey. We see coming into the 21st century, the rise in Europe. And what was the product of this Islamophobia? Where in France, the hijab was banned, and there was an outcry in the Muslim world with regards to it. that banning actually produced something which was good for the Muslims. Prior to the ban in France, there were no Islamic schools. All Muslim children, they went to government schools. And there's some 5 million plus Muslims in France. Going to government schools meant they were exposed to traditional, conventional teachings which were secular, directly opposed in part to Islamic teachings. With the ban, Muslim schools arose and Muslims were able now for the first time to take control over the educational process of their children. So with each new challenge, we find Islam becoming stronger. So my view, when we look into the 21st century, where we are now, is that the negative forces which create this false image about Islam, having their own agenda, in fact, instead of weakening Islam and Muslims, it strengthens them. We have been strengthened. The 21st century, in spite of all that's going on, whether it was the World Trade Center or other tragedies that we're faced with, Boko Haram, Shabab, ISIS, etc. These are aberrations. They're not the true Islam. We all know that. They're a consequence of the attempt to hold Islam down, to keep it back. So much so that those who today, in the 21st century, promote Islam, just speak about Islam, just say Muslims be Muslims, are labeled as terrorist preachers. For example, Dr. Zakir Naik, a personal friend of mine. Dr. Zakir Naik cannot even live in India today. They want to put him in jail and throw away the key. He is banned from all the countries of Europe to America, Canada, around the world, even in the East, Bangladesh, etc. He even ran into some problems here in Malaysia, in and out. A person who is only speaking about Islam, not with any ties to any, groups that are known to be terroristic or etc. But yet, so many efforts made to put him away. They want to silence him. To silence Islam. But, alhamdulillah, he established Peace TV. The first global Islamic channel. He did what Muslim countries should have done long time ago. In the Gulf, we have so many countries with so many different TVs because they can afford them, etc. Global TVs. But nothing promoting Islam. So alhamdulillah, he established Peace TV, reaching some 124 million viewers around the world. According to statistics, he is the most viewed personality, individual in the world. Dr. Zakir Naik. He is a part of the future. Others will rise. I'm not a fortune teller. Fortune telling is forbidden in Islam. But as I look at the trends, I see a bright future for Islam. As Muslims become more and more conscious, the bonds that bind us override the divisions that were created by our colonial masters of the past. I see Muslim countries coming together. When I listen to the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, speaking about what happened to Morsi in Egypt, I see that bond. Yes, Morsi was overthrown. He only lasted for 1 year, but he represented something new in the Muslim world. A Muslim leader, president, head of the country, who was Hafiz of the Quran and who expressed it in his speeches. That is the rise of Islam. And as His Excellency spoke, and those who came before me also spoke, education is at the crux of it all. And this is the century of education on a greater and greater scale. A scale which is magnified by the internet. And my university, Islamic Online University, in 7 years of operation, had not 270 students, as was said, but 270,000 students in 7 years. 270,000 students. This was something unheard of. This is the future. The brick and mortar universities that we know today, they won't be. This is what the educators predict. All the big universities are now making their courses accessible online, free. You can access them. And the more and more that the internet plays a bigger and bigger role, the more and more Muslims will be in contact with each other. The message of Islam will reach the world. And I believe we will provide for the future. If not technology, we will provide the moral compass which is missing in the world today. The moral compass which was destroyed by secularism. Secularism, which was the religion of the 20th century, as God was taken out of the classroom in the West. We, inshallah, will bring God back into the classroom for the future. And with that, we will guarantee a future pleasing to Allah and pleasing to Muslims worldwide and beneficial to humankind, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. Well, I must apologize, Dr. Bilal Phillips, for missing the 3 zeros in your number of students, 270,000 students. I do stand corrected. Alhamdulillah. There you are, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes the distinguished session. Once again, our heartfelt thanks to our 3 distinguished speakers. May we now kindly invite the 3 speakers to leave the stage and take their seats on the floor. three very interesting presentations and food for thought for us for this conference. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this session here this morning. Ampun tuanku, Alhamdulillah, disembah maklumkan bahawa dengan itu sempurnalah sudah majlis pagi ini. Bagi pihak pengelola, patut sekali lagi menafak sembah, menjunjung setinggi-tinggi kasih di atas limpah perkenan Yang Maha Mulia Tuanku berangkat mencebaduli untuk menyempurnakan majlis ini. Majlis sekarang menjemput Yang Bahagia Tan Sri Profesor Dr. Nur Kardi untuk bergadap, menafak sembah dan mengiringi Yang Maha Mulia Paduka Seri Sultan Perak Darul Rizwan untuk melawat pameran dan selepas itu ke majlis santapan diiringi Yang Amat Berhormat Menteri Besar Perak Darul Rizwan. Hadirin sekalian, mengumumkan keberangkatan Yang Maha Mulia Paduka Seri Sultan Perak Darul Rizwan diiringi oleh Yang Amat Berhormat Menteri Besar. Kepada para tetamu, to all guests who have received invitations for lunch, you are cordially invited to adjourn to the ballroom, behind this ballroom, the next ballroom. And to all participants of the conference, please remain where you are as we will continue with the next session